listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. It's impossible to watch footage out of Gaza and to not feel distressed at the images of displaced families, especially when that footage shows children. Save the Children, the international organisation tasked with protecting kids in crises overseas, estimates up to 21,000 are missing in the chaos of the Gaza war.
We know that at least 20,000 children in Gaza are missing. This includes children who have been separated from their parents or loved ones and are unaccompanied, essentially lost.
That story is coming up. First, though, Bension Siebert is here with the day's top stories. It is Tuesday, the 9th of July.
Morning, Sasha. Unfortunately, we start with a story that also involves children being harmed overseas. Ukraine's biggest children's hospital has been bombed as part of a series of Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian cities overnight. At least 36 people have been killed, and reports say more than 100 people were wounded in the attacks, and people remain unaccounted for under the rubble of destroyed buildings.
President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed retaliation, saying Russia knew where its missiles would land. Moscow has denied targeting civilian infrastructure, though. The hospital that was hit is Ukraine's largest treatment centre for kids with cancer. And it's not known how many doctors and patients are trapped under the rubble. At least 5, though, have been confirmed dead. And Bension, this represents one of the biggest attacks on Ukrainian soil since Russia's invasion in 2022. Volodymyr Zelensky said at least 40 missiles were fired during the attack.
Yeah, and this happened on the eve of the planned NATO summit in Washington. Just for background, NATO is the agreement between European countries and the US that says that they'll all defend any country if the group is attacked. And analysts believe the expansion of NATO into territory closer to Russia was one of the key reasons for President Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. Alice Springs has been thrown into a snap 3-night curfew this week after a series of violent incidents.
I'm very aware it's a really important week for the Territory and Australia in NAIDOC week. I don't want to be disruptive. We will still have a policing presence, but only the declared area will come into force from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And yes, it is a curfew, and it applies to all classes of people. It will apply to adults, it will apply to youth, it will apply to everyone.
Police Commissioner Michael Murphy there. The curfew came into effect last night and will run from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. until Thursday. Speaking about the violence, NT Police Minister Brent Potter said it had been a horror 72 hours that included a stabbing, a police officer being run over by a car, and 4 off-duty police officers being assaulted by a group of around 20 young people.
Yeah, and as we heard, unlike the curfew that we saw back in April that only applied to children and minors under 18, this curfew is going to apply to everybody, adults included, and anyone found to be out in public during the curfew can be arrested and charged with an offence. There are exceptions, though, if you're escaping domestic violence, visiting family, caring for someone, or if you're going to and from work. It is disappointing to see this happening again in the Alice during NAIDOC week, because the big concern for people on the ground who are Indigenous or work with Indigenous communities is that it's going to negatively or disproportionately impact those communities in the Alice and around who, one of the criticisms I saw was talking about the fact that there might be people who aren't engaged in the news of the day. They head off into the town, they don't realise what's happening, and then they find themselves having to deal with police. I do remember with the last curfew, though, the idea was that anyone who was found in the town during these hours, it wasn't a matter of arresting them and charging them and making criminals out of them. It was, okay, we're going to escort you back home. And that was specifically when it involved children. We heard how bad it's been in the Alice over the last 72 hours. There are hopes this will serve as a kind of circuit breaker. But once again, community leaders in Alice Springs say that they need to address the grassroots issues, not just lock everyone up every night and hope for the best.
US President Joe Biden has thrown down the gauntlet for his colleagues in the Democratic Party, telling them to challenge him for the presidential nomination if they don't think he's fit.
I'm getting so frustrated by the elites
Now, I'm not talking about you guys, but about the elites in the party who they know so much more. But if any of these guys don't think I should run against me, go ahead, announce for president. Challenge me in the convention.
It is funny to hear the literal US president saying that these are the elites. But that was the US president speaking on MSNBC there. Now, it comes after Biden wrote a forcefully worded letter to congressional Democrats telling them it's time for the speculation about his candidacy to end. According to US media, sources on Capitol Hill say this week will be critical for the president, with some anticipating Tuesday local time, maybe when the dam could break, with members due to hold a caucus meeting.
So there are 42 days until the convention, and I think it's worth giving some context because that's seen as the bookmark, that is seen as the place when we will know for sure who is running for the presidential nominee for the Democrats. Now, that is where, at that convention, which is happening in August, they proclaim, they formally name that nominee. And for the Republicans, that's actually happening next week. It's happening over 3 days, kicking off on the 15th of July, and Donald Trump is widely expected to take that nomination there. So yeah, there's this pressure for, if they're going to put someone else in, they need to do it soon so that they can bed themselves in before the convention so that they can make a name for themselves and convince party members that they're the right person for the job.
Absolutely. And the most likely person, if Biden does withdraw, is, of course, Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, if anyone's seen the TV show Veep, they'll know that the Vice President doesn't have a great deal of control over what they do politically. They're seen as someone who needs to support the administration, support the president. So, like you said, if Biden is going to withdraw, it really needs to happen pretty soon because Kamala Harris needs that opportunity to establish herself as her own political voice if she's going to have any chance of beating Donald Trump in November.
Oh, what a way to finish. It's a mic drop moment for Alex de Minaur. 6-2, 6-4, he is a quarterfinalist at Wimbledon.
Yes, that is right. Aussie Alex de Minaur is into the quarterfinals at Wimbledon for the very first time in his career. The 25-year-old managed to overcome dropping the third set to down Frenchman Arthur Fils 6-2, 6-4, 4-6, 6-3. The concern now, though, will be whether he's fit in time for the next match because he appeared to pull up lame during match point. But he told the crowd in his post-match interview that he'll find a way and that he'll be okay. Now, the Demon is set to play either Novak Djokovic or Holger Rune at the time of this recording. That match is in progress. Djokovic obviously is the favourite in that one. So it'll be a good match when we see the Demon go up against Djokovic.
Can't wait.
Thanks, Spencer, for being here for the headlines. Not a tennis fan?
Not a huge tennis fan, but look, I like to see an Australian doing well. So that's
exactly. Great. We can all relate to that. Look, next up, we are switching pace. It is our deep dive looking into the missing children of Gaza, those that have been impacted by the war and are either missing or buried under rubble. It's a really important chat, so we hope you'll stick around for it. The war in Gaza entered its 9th month this week. The scenes of devastation are heartbreaking, but it's the human cost of the war that is the most disturbing. In the last few days, thousands of people were told to evacuate as the Israeli Defense Force expanded its ground invasion into areas of the Tafah, Daraj and Old City neighbourhoods. Families were rounded up and moved on, often carrying nothing more than the clothes on their backs. The Palestinian death toll is now at more than 38,000 people, while the Israelis have lost more than 1,100. Save the Children, the international organisation tasked with keeping kids safe in crises, says as many as 21,000 are missing in Gaza. Many are trapped beneath rubble, they're detained, buried in unmarked graves, or lost from their families. Today, we wanted to get an update on what's happening on the ground for kids in Gaza and shine a light on the horrific impacts of the conflict on these little ones. Joining me now to talk about it is Alexandra Saieh, the head of Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy at Save the Children International. She's on the line from Washington. Alexandra, thanks for joining us on the briefing. The Ministry of Health in Gaza has confirmed the deaths of at least 14,000 children in this conflict, but you say there are thousands more that are still missing. Is that right?
Thank you. Yeah, that's correct. We know that the Ministry of Health in Gaza has said that at least 14,000 children have been killed over the last 9 months. But the reality is we won't truly know the number until there is a ceasefire and until hospitals have the capacity to fully function again. We know that at least 20,000 children in Gaza are missing. This includes children who have been separated from their parents or loved ones and are unaccompanied, essentially lost. This includes at least 4,000 who are buried under the rubble of their own homes, now presumed dead. This also includes children whose bodies were buried in unmarked mass graves. We've seen several mass graves uncovered over the last several months. And this also includes children who have been detained or disappeared by Israeli forces and their whereabouts are unknown. It's very difficult to establish the full identity of a child who has been killed. Some children's bodies, due to the use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, have been harmed beyond recognition. It's really graphic to think about it.
Paint a picture for us of what life is like for the average family in Gaza right now. What does the day-to-day look like? And, what access do they have to things like food and water and medicine if they need it? And for children, school and playtime.
So the number one thing to remember is that nowhere in Gaza is safe for anyone. And so that means that parents are more focused on surviving another day, and getting the food that children need to survive more so than anything else. And when we talk about food, I mean food with adequate nutrients is difficult to come by. If you have a little bit more money, you may be able to afford more than others, but these places are not safe. We've seen continued attacks on areas that have been previously declared safe. And so that also puts pressures on families to flee again and again and again. In terms of the hospitals, almost every hospital in Gaza has either been damaged, issued an evacuation order, or their supplies are depleting. So we still hear reports of mothers having to go through C-sections without anesthetics, children having to go through amputations without anesthetics, doctors basically working with the most basic of supplies. Many medical organizations tell us that they haven't been able to get any medical supplies since the closure of the Rafah crossing, the crossing between Egypt and Gaza, which closed back in the beginning of May. And so the situation is incredibly dire. The other thing to remember is that there's no electricity right now in Gaza. So the entire population, if they need to power anything, relies on fuel. There are very little supplies of fuel in Gaza. Hospitals run on generators that are supplied on fuel, and we constantly hear reports of hospitals running out of fuel. This impacts children's cancer care, dialysis, lights in a hospital. We hear reports regularly of doctors having to conduct trauma surgeries without any lights. And so this is what the situation is like in Gaza.
Is there any sort of semblance of normality for children? Are they getting lessons in school? Are they, playing with their friends and with their brothers and sisters? Or is it pure, utter devastation where there is no normalcy for these kids?
School establishes a sense of normalcy for children, but there is no schooling in Gaza right now. There's a complete absence of education. Almost every school in Gaza has either been destroyed or it's being used to house displaced people. And so there are no school facilities. Every single university in Gaza has been damaged or destroyed. Where children have been able to find some sense of normalcy is maybe through temporary learning spaces that some organizations have helped establish. Save the Children does this in other conflict zones, and we're trying to do this in Gaza, but it's not to the level that we would like it to be.
We've talked about, the children that have been killed, that are buried under rubble, that are missing. What about famine? Because we've heard so much about, and you've touched on it there, there's not enough food or water getting into Gaza, and children are at that phase where, they're growing, they need nutrients. Do we know how many kids in Gaza are impacted by malnutrition?
There are thousands of children in Gaza who are impacted from severe and acute malnutrition. At least 34 have been identified as having died from malnutrition, dehydration, and disease. But we think that this is only the tip of the iceberg. These are the children whose parents managed to get them to health facilities. We think that many more are suffering and dying from severe malnutrition and dehydration and disease. And the reason is we know that not enough food has entered the Gaza Strip over the last several months. And we also know that there's essentially no clean water. And so this is what's fueling a lot of the dehydration. And when children suffer from malnutrition, they're at higher likelihood of dying from common diseases like diarrhea and pneumonia and jaundice. We know these are diseases that are rampant in Gaza right now. The impact of malnutrition, of severe acute malnutrition on children is not just dire in the short term, but also the long term. When children suffer from malnutrition, their muscles waste away, their vision blurs, their organs fail, their immune systems shut down, and their hearts stop. It's actually a very painful way of dying. And it also, even if treated, can have long-term impacts on their cognitive and physical abilities. So it's just absolutely horrific.
Alexandra, in your experience, what is the long-term mental, we've talked about the physical there in terms of malnutrition. What is the long-term mental impacts for children who might survive this conflict, but then go on to try and lead, a normal life or a fulfilling life? How will this conflict impact their ability to do that?
One parent recently told us that when the father talked about his son, he described it as complete psychological destruction. Some children are so traumatized that even when there is food available, they're too traumatized to even eat. And we were seeing a heavy psychological toll on children in Gaza even before this most recent military escalation. 2 years ago, Save the Children conducted a survey of children in Gaza, a survey on their mental health, and found that 3 out of 5 children had thoughts of self-harm. 4 out of 5 children were suffering from depression and other symptoms, which include bedwetting and nightmares, and had essentially no hope for the future. So this war has robbed children of their childhoods, of any sort of sense of safety and security, but also the infrastructure that children rely on to prosper in the future, like education buildings, schools, hospitals, playgrounds, have been so severely damaged or destroyed that this crisis is going to impact Palestinian children in Gaza for generations to come.
Alexandra, it's a reminder that while the so-called grown-ups are trying to eke it out in deals, these are the real victims, is the children whose suffering is just going to continue. Quickly, where can people go to help or to learn more if they'd like to?
If people want to know more, Save the Children is always publishing news stories about the situation on the ground, and they could go to our website. There are also many other humanitarian organizations that are working in Gaza that are sharing information and news about the latest facing children in Gaza and the West Bank. So you can go to our website. And it's just really important for people to stay up to date with what's going on and share with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, what's happening in Gaza. And everyone can do more by providing donations to organizations that are working, but also calling on your politicians, your governments to support a ceasefire in Gaza and calling on governments to stop fueling the crisis.
Alexandra, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
That was Alexandra Saieh, Head of Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy at Save the Children International. And that is all for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for listening. Before you go, we would really appreciate it if you could share this episode with someone you think might want to listen to it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sasha Barbagat. See you next time.